Father Tim to get our gathering going.
In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Lord, we praise you and bless you. We thank you for this day. We thank you for bringing us together. We thank God for Dr. John Ries to come here and do a presentation on who is not at the table. And we pray for blessings upon him. We pray for blessings upon all of us here, that we grow in holiness and love of you, O Lord, all the days of our lives. We pray for everyone we know in any way who is sick and suffering. Show them your love, mercy, and healing power. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. Welcome, Dr. John Ries.
I want to briefly thank the parish staff. So many details go into all of this, and they're very supportive. Father Tim, Don, Deb, Kavita, everyone. And also thank the ministries, the hospitality ministry with us this weekend. And that's always such a great time to build community and enjoy each other. And also the St. Francis Peace Through Justice ministry that sponsors these talks. I'm Sandy Ashley. I'm a member of the St. Francis Peace Through Justice ministry. So, Bishop Vetter has talked around the diocese, I think, I've heard him for about a year and a half, talking about the numbers of people who have left the church. I think it's something like in the last 2 decades, we've lost a third of the Catholics, of 60,000 in our Western Montana diocese. So this is obviously something that's critically important that we want to understand and pay attention to and figure out. So, and many of us, myself included, have family and friends who have left the church or who no longer attend Mass. And I know some of you, have also questioned myself and been in a discernment process, not so much with where I am with my faith, but where things are in the church at times. And I don't think that's bad. In fact, I think it's good. But at any rate, Dr. John Ries of Carroll College, head of the theology department, a member of Our Lady of the Valley Parish, has graciously agreed to speak to us on this topic, as Father Tim said, who's not at the table. So help me in welcoming John, and we're very, very appreciative of having you here, John, today to help us address this issue. Thank you.
Is that a good spot? You guys hear me okay? Yeah. Okay. So good morning. Good to see you all. Thanks for the invite. This is going to be a little bit different for me. So I teach at Carroll, and most of the time when I teach, I have something that I'm going to present that's kind of pretty fixed, and I make sure that I've got kind of know the answers to all the questions that people are going to ask before they ask them. This will not be the case today, right? I want to begin to explore a question of this: who's not at the table and why? I think it's a very, very important question for us. It's one that's been bothering me for quite some time, right? And it's really hard to kind of wrap your head around it and get a sense of what's there. How do we get to what's important here? I don't think it's an easy or simple question, but it's an important one. I think it's one as a church that we cannot not ask, right? And wonder and think. But it's not a simple one to answer. Sometimes it might even be a bit of a disturbing question. So as we try to think about this question, obviously I'm playing with the metaphor of a table, right? It was very nice they agreed that we could have round tables today. I thought that was very nice, right, and appropriate, right? But it's an important part of our religious tradition, right? That we gather, I was just up at Mass before, right? we gather at table, we can say, right, around the altar, right? We're recalling some of the origins of our Christian faith from back to the Last Supper, right? But we also have to remember Jesus' ministry is not reduced to the Last Supper, right? There are many times he fed people. He sought out people who were not exactly what we would call regular churchgoers of his day. Obviously, there wasn't church yet, right? But I think we need to kind of really reflect upon this question as a part of our identity. And in order to do so, I want to play off of kind of three themes. The first of which will be an ecclesial theme, a theme of church. Well, what does it mean to be church, right? A second, which would be more Eucharistic, and a third, which would be service. Now, these three things are not totally separable, but that's going to be the way that I'm going to approach trying to start to think about the question as I've been thinking about it. In thinking about the question, I'm reminded of, I feel, can I be heard if I just step away like this?
Yeah.
Right, it'll come out a little bit easier for me, right? And so I find very helpful, there's a book I read a long time ago called In the Beginning. It's written by a man who writes a lot of novels about Orthodox Jews and whatnot, right? And he starts off with it's a very common phrase from the Midrash of the scholars of the Jewish Bible, right, of the Hebrew Scriptures, right, that all beginnings are hard. And I think that's true, right? That it's important when you go into a beginning not to expect all of the answers to just magically appear, right? So when you first start studying a complex subject matter, right, the beginnings are kind of hard. How do you get your bearings? How do you know what's where? And I think this is important because today is just meant to be a kind of beginning conversation to start thinking a little bit out loud and sharing ideas of who's missing, right? Who's not at the table and why. It's something I think we've all somewhere or another come up against, as you kind of referred to there, Sandy, right? You know, that sense in which we know something of this, right? Well, how do we think about it? How do we approach the question? And so to do that, I'm going to start first off with, so I will fall a little bit on my kind of academic background. I can't help but think about Vatican II. I can't help but think about Vatican II because Vatican II comes up at a time, right, when the church is facing lots of problems. We sometimes forget that, right? After World War II, it was rather a mess in Europe, right? It was a mess in Africa that was trying to decolonize. It was a mess in terms of the beginnings of the Cold War, right? The second day of the council is the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? You know, so we should remember that even in the great things, the documents that they came to produce, in part, it came out of problematic realities. And they were very intentional at Vatican II not to focus on trying to find heresies or get rid of heresies. It was a pastoral council who wanted to think about how can we be church, right? Where we are now, right? And so it was a very good opportunity. The bishops gathered from all over the world and they produced a book that's like so thick, right? You know, of all kinds of documents about what it means to be church in many different aspects. Two of which are constitutions, Lumen Gentium and Gaudium et Spes. And there's a couple of images that I think were helpful to bring forward with us. So first they wanted to figure out, by looking inward, who are we as church? This is Lumen Gentium, it's the dogmatic constitution on church, right? So who are we as church? The primary metaphor that they used for that is, church is the people of God. That's the core, that's the center. That's what the church is. And then this people of God, right, is help to be held together by all kinds of things. But it's the community that is the core, right? And they thought about, well, how do we have to make sure that we keep that core of being Lumen Gentium, the light of Christ to the peoples? How do we do that? Notice they didn't say, it's not, I don't know what it would be in Latin, my Latin's not that good, but it's not Lumen Catholicus, right? You know, it's not a light to the Catholics, right? It's a light to peoples everywhere. Well, how do you be that? Much of Vatican II struggles with trying to figure out how can we actually do that? How can we be church where we are? So the two threads that I'm going to pull out is one of which is the idea of, to be church, we have to read the signs of the times, right? What are the signs of the times, right? Back in the 1960s, that's a long time ago, the signs of the times were different. And so we're going to think a little bit about the signs of our times. How are they working, and how do we address those, right? So an easy one for many of us to remember is that way back when, they're thinking, well, how do we better be church? Well, one of the adaptations that they made was switching from Latin everywhere to be able to be in people's mother tongue. And I think it's better to think of it in that way, because my experience is there are two things where when people speak not their mother tongue, that they'll always go back to their mother tongue for. Usually one of them is cursing. The other one is praying, right? And so the church made some pretty big shifts, right, in trying to figure out how can this experience of Eucharist better speak or resonate with people, right? That's an easy example to pick out. I think there are many of them that are there, right? And we're going to see one of those ecclesial going forward when we talk a little bit about the synod, right? What a synod is and what a synod tries to do. Tries to play off of that imagery. So reading the signs of the times. So I'll talk a little bit about where I grew up and how I grew up as a Catholic, right? Thinking that way, what is church, how did church work, etc. And then kind of fast or quickly go up to more or less where we are today. And then try to think about that here. Then I'm going to ask you guys to talk to each other a little bit, right? With a couple of questions in mind, and then we'll try to come back and draw some of those, what comes up from here, from there, from the differing tables. Hopefully this will work, right? That's the idea. The second idea that I wanted to draw from is that notion in Lumen Gentium that to be church is to be a pilgrim church. We're not there yet. And that image of being a pilgrim, not so much like the Mayflower, et cetera, pilgrim, but people on a pilgrimage, on a journey, right? I tease with my students sometimes. I lived for a while literally across a church called St. Jacob's Kerk in Belgium. I went to school, lived a long time in Belgium. It used to be a place where people passed through to go on pilgrimage. This is up in Belgium, all the way to Santiago de Compostela, if anybody's ever heard of that, right? So St. Jacob, St. James, right, is the name of the church, right? And people would leave and they would go. Has anybody ever seen the film The Way? Yeah. It's a good example of people from all different places that happen to meet each other on the road, and they're different when they get to St. James than when they started, right? But it doesn't happen like that. It doesn't happen overnight, right? There's a way in which they figure it out along the way. The church, to be a pilgrim church, has to continually figure itself out along the way and adapt. One last word from Vatican II. So anybody ever heard the word aggiornamento? right? This is one of the key phrases that they use. It's an Italian phrase, of course, because it happens in Italy, right? But it became a common phrase. In English, it's often it's often translated as to update. I don't think that's the best translation. I'm a little bit more literalistic. Aggiornamento, to the dayness. How does something be present, but like really present? Like maybe we would say here and now. How do we be church? Has to deal with here and now, right? We can have all kinds of great ideas and principles, but we actually got to live it out in the present. Reading the signs of the times of where we're at. I'm going to use one last image to play with this a little bit, to think about how that works. We all know something about a notion of being a pilgrim in a sense of when we have to do something, when we have some kind of an assignment, we might call it a mission, right? We have things that we want to do. So as church, we want to be the light of Christ in the world, right? But we got to figure it out on this day's journey, the next day's journey. And on that pilgrimage, you learn something from the past, but you also come into the new. And the image I often use in my classes is, so I guess my oldest is 26 years old, so I'm a dad of 4 kids. We have some idea of what a dad is, but you actually really figure it out in and along the way. And with each kid, it's a little bit different, and at different ages, it's a little bit different, but you kind of figure out what the meaning of it is as you go, right? In part, church needs to do that too. We need to be a pilgrim church, right? We have our mission, we have our Santiago de Compostela that we want to get to, right? We want to be that light of Christ in the world to all peoples. How do we do that? I think this is kind of an important background then when we kind of approach the question, and I like the way that you, I would say kind of struggled with, well, what do we call the people not at the table? Right? Are they ex-Catholics? Are they, what is it, right? What is the group? And that's going to be really, really hard to talk about because my guess is none of them are in the room. This is the struggle, right? Who's not here and why? Right? And sometimes there's very nice reasons like, yeah, I had a flat tire. Well, that's why you're not here, right? But it's deeper than that, right? It's where and how has church worked and where and how has church struggled or been challenged? Okay, so going back to some older signs of the times. So I grew up in St. Louis, a pretty big Catholic city in the Midwest, right? And when I went there, I would say from the time I was in college, there were about 270 parishes in the diocese. So it was a pretty big diocese. My own home parish, Mary Queen of Peace, another Mary, I can't seem to escape Mary, between here and Our Lady of the Valley. At Mary Queen of Peace, we had at least 3 full-time priests, sometimes 4, right? This was common in St. Louis. I went to grade school, high school, and college in St. Louis that were all Catholic. This was very, very common, right? I think at the time there were somewhere around a little over 600 diocesan priests, plus all kinds of other priests like the Jesuits and the Dominicans, etc. So there were a lot of priests, even more women religious. It was very, very kind of part of the culture of the city. Growing up, where did I play soccer? With my parish, right? Where did I go to school? At my parish, right? The Catholic high schools were a little bit different. They collected people from different places and all from different parishes, but it was still that sense in which the Catholic parish was really, really central. Most of my mom and dad's friends were parishioners, right? It's kind of the world in which it was. Of course, it's not quite the same anymore. They're going through a reorganization process. I was looking up some data from the number of parishes that have closed, right? It's an incredible number, and it's been experienced, I think, here in Montana, here as well. But they went from about 250 parishes or so, right, down to I think it was the year, let me check. It was a handful of years ago, they were down to 178, and their new plan is to go down to 100 at most. That's tough, right? That's going to change things, right? Most parishes originally in the city were in the city where almost everybody would walk to church. Every few blocks, there was a parish. And very often there was a German parish here, and then 3 blocks down there was an Italian parish. And so it was really your church, your neighborhood, your sports teams, they were all kind of blended together. That is not the case anymore. The vast majority of Catholics in St. Louis now live actually out in the suburbs. They've closed all kinds of churches that are, hundreds of years, hundreds. I can't quite go that far, but, well more than 100 years old, getting up to 200 years old. Of the oldest churches when the immigrants came over, most of those churches are closed and done, right? So we live in a different world. And in St. Louis, they're trying to figure out now how are we going to do this. They also have had a reduced number of priests. So how's that going to work? I think we experience a similar problem here in Montana, right? I don't know as much Montana history as probably a number of you in the room here, but I get the impression Butte was a little bit like that for a while, right? Fairly big city, obviously. What was it, up to 100,000 or something? Yeah. And it had lots of different ethnic groups, lots of different parishes, etc. But as that comes apart, then what ends up happening, right? All of a sudden, church becomes the place you go on Sunday, but not the other days, right? It's not so much a part of the regular, everyday life of people. That's one of the struggles that I think that we face as church today, right? In our context here. In different parts of the world, it'll be different, right? But this is something that we're certainly facing here. I believe in Helena there's 57 parishes. Does that sound right?
The diocese.
Diocese, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
What did I say? Oh, Helena. I should stick back closer to my notes, right? So there's about 57 parishes, right? And like 38 missions. Of course, that may not be true from when I looked that up, right? There has been even more kind of shifting and trying to figure out how are we going to do this, right? And in the foreseeable future, I imagine it's going to be there, right? I don't know, other than the cathedral and the Jesuit parish in Missoula, I don't know any parish that has more than one priest in it. Does anybody?
Christ King and Resurrection.
Resurrection does as well? Okay. So those 3 would be the only ones.
And
What?
Christ the King and Missoula.
Christ the King. So that's what, 1, 2, 3, 4, right? But the others are down to 1, right? And many of those serve a mission parish as well, right? So what's that going to look like? And certainly for Roman Catholics, right, what we would call church going usually means you come to church on Sunday for Eucharist, that's going to be challenged, isn't it? I mean, I think recently the parish in Helmville has been closed, has it not? Now what happens? Where do people go? It's certainly not going to be a neighborhood kind of experience of church, right? It's going to be a lot harder when churches are more spread out. How do you do the things church needs to do, right? Can you have things like this? Do you guys do religious education on Wednesdays?
Yeah.
Right. Well, how do you do that then? How do you get people involved? I'm kind of curious for you guys how it works here. Down at Our Lady of the Valley, we use this time period for our Sunday school or our RE classes, right? Well, where do you fit it in? And it's hard. I imagine, anybody here happen to teach in the program here? I imagine there's a little bit of a struggle in terms of when certain sporting seasons are around. How does that work, right? Worked out really good at the parish soccer team, basketball team, etc., right? You know, because you made your schedules around the church schedule. Well, one of the things that we're experiencing in many places throughout the United States is that kind of disconnect from our everyday, todayness life. How is it that we can function as a parish with the needs of people? Back when I was a kid, so I was born in 1960, right? You know, my mom was a first grade teacher, etc. And once she started having kids, guess what? She was a full-time mom, right? That was not uncommon in the parish. Who worked in the kitchen so that we had lunches at our Catholic grade school? Mothers, right? So now, how many mothers work? Far more, right? Where's even just the time spaces to be church? To be church, not just showing up to go to Mass, but all the other things for how the community works. So we're going to struggle with stuff like that, right? So I think the dynamics in our society have kind of shifted what a parish is and how a parish can work. And it's something parishes are going to have to figure out as best they can, right? In that same time period, obviously, I would imagine the majority of your teachers for your RE program are lay people, right? Well, that wasn't the case when I was a kid, right? It was sometimes the priest, and it was a lot of times the nuns, right? You know, well, we don't have that structure so much anymore, do we? Where are we going to go to? What are we going to find? I think more recently, in the diocese, or actually you guys had it here for Helena when they did the listening sessions for the synod. So the synod is an interesting, and I'd say kind of an extension from the Second Vatican Council. There was this idea that how do we get local churches more involved in our being church as a whole, right? How do those voices come to be included? Vatican II started that off very nicely by getting over 2,000 bishops from around the world to gather for a council. Council of Trent started off with, I think, like 235 bishops or something, right? You know, it's very different, right? How do we get that feedback in, right? How does that happen? How does local church work? And the movement of a synod is trying to, and we tried to have listening sessions around the diocese, as every other diocese tried to do, recognizing that being church can't start from a church document and just figure out, apply this, apply this, apply this. Already by having to go out and listen and to say, what do people think about? Where are our problems? Where are the difficulties in our being church? How do we get those to kind of come to the top? So it's even aware to a local bishop, much less the U.S. bishops, much less the worldwide church, right? So how is it that we can think about and talk about what our experience of being church is? So we haven't finished the synod process yet, but at least in those first steps, trying to incorporate what people were thinking, right? Because one of the assumptions we can all make, I do this as a teacher, I assume a lot of things on the student's part. But you don't know exactly what their background is in whatever subject matter you're teaching, right? To really be a teacher, what do you got to do? You got to kind of figure out where the students are at. What do they understand? What do they not understand? What kind of images can I draw with them? What kind of language do you speak? But to a certain degree, you got to let go of what you want to teach them in order to catch them where they are. Well, church needs to do that too. If we want to be the light of Christ to the world, that's great. But we got to know who the people of God are. What is their experience? Right? We had those leading questions. Did anybody attend the session that was here by chance? So some of you guys did, right? So the idea was to try to collect some information. Maybe it wasn't done perfectly, but it's better than saying nothing, right? Because what's going to tend to happen when you get a group of people together to start talking about church? You're going to usually point out where some of your problems are, right? You're going to point out where struggles are, right? Or, why did they switch the 8 o'clock mass to a 7 o'clock mass? or something of that sort, right? When you have to start moving things around and changing things, that gets kind of hard sometimes, right? And so how is it that you get the voices of people involved? So at least it was an attempt to try to get, starting on the diocesan level, in some places starting on the parish level. In the Diocese of Helena, I think they kind of clustered some parishes together to do that. But ideally, to get the common average parishioner, what's going on? How has church done church well? They actually use the journey metaphor, if you notice. It comes from the word for synod. So a synod is those that are kind of like assembled together with. So playing off of that kind of journey or pilgrim imagery, there's a way in which being church is, how do we journey this together? That's complicated, right? And so they tried to bring all kinds of stuff in. Anybody remember any of the guiding questions? How has the church served you well? Maybe where has church fallen short or been challenging, right? You don't want to just hear the bad and the ugly, right? You also want to hear the good, right? Well, what is that? And how has that worked? What has worked well in the journey and what hasn't worked well in the journey? And if you're not talking about it, the next day of the journey is not going to be a whole lot better, is it, right? So there's got to be a way in which church has to kind of start talking to itself better. That's kind of the idea behind the synod, right? And how do we do that, right? We're going to get a little practice of that today, I think. It would also note, and they notice it too, the importance of listening. To really listen. To not already know where we're going to go and then I want your feedback. How do you really listen? As a dad, how do you get what your kid's really saying and where they're coming from? I'm going to tell a silly story now. I think I got time for it. I'm going to tell a silly story. I remember picking up my second grade daughter from school. She went to, at that time we were living in St. Charles, just outside of St. Louis. And of course, I'm driving the car, picked her up, right? And of course she sits in the back seat because she's still little, et cetera, et cetera. So she sits in the back seat. And we had a front seat, back seat conversation, right? And she was talking to me about, oh, today we saw John the Baptist. I said, you saw John the Baptist? I said, no, you know, obviously you didn't have that historical sense yet. It was a film strip that they watched about John the Baptist. But there was this just interesting conversation where, well, how does somebody who's got a degree in theology converse, you know, with my my 8-year-old or whatever she was at the time, right, about John the Baptist? And well, you know, they didn't actually take pictures back then. And you know, how do you get those worlds to come together, right? You really have to listen. I mean, it took me a while to kind of figure out sometimes, and sometimes it still does as a father. It takes me time to kind of figure out, what are they really asking me? Or what are they really saying in saying this, right? And so there's a way in which listening, I think, is one of the keys. But boy, listening is hard. Listening without already having a response in mind before you finish your sentence. We've all experienced that, right? That's a little bit of a risk of listening. It's even harder to listen. And the Synod intentionally wants to listen from the periphery, right? It's not so hard to figure out what the bishops already think. They've got groups and ways in which this, and they kind of know each other, et cetera. It's much harder once you get out into the parish. So how is it that listening can really happen? And really listening, right? Most of the time as parents at a certain point when you have kids and you're growing up, no, we're going to church on Sunday. No, we're going to church on Sunday, right? You know, at what point, so my youngest just went off to college this year. How do you have those conversations now? Did you go to church on Sunday? Did you, how does that work? How do you start to hear what it's like from their experience, especially now that, you know, she's not living at home, she's not, right? It's a little bit harder. How do we listen and not simply strategize as to how we're going to respond and not really hear what they're saying? That's tough. Listening is going to be, I think, one of our biggest challenges going forward. All the harder listening to those that aren't at the table. But I think that's going to be key. So before we go further, I want to shift a little bit here. I'll just say this one last thing. So this is coming right out of the document. They gathered the documents together kind of by continent and whatnot. And they put out a report on it, and this is just a quote straight from it. The vision of a church capable of radical inclusion, shared belonging, and deep hospitality, according to the teachings of Jesus, is at the heart of the synodal process. Instead of behaving like gatekeepers trying to exclude others from the table, we need to do more to make sure that people know that everyone can find a place and a home here. I think that's a very, very big challenge. So I suggest going forward that we do this. Think a little bit in terms of your own experience. So I've used the metaphor of the table, right? And I want us to think a little bit about how is it that you're at the table? What includes you? Why'd you come today? Or why do you go to church? What is your experience of church? What really makes church work as church? Right? I think that would be interesting to think about, and I'm going to say, before we try to answer, like, why aren't people coming? It's interesting if you guys would share at your tables with each other, well, why do you come? Why are you at the table? Right? Does that work? Is that going to be too hard? Can I make an assignment like that? So we're supposed to go to about 10:15, so I say 5-10 minutes. Is that all right? growing up in St. Louis, you went to the church of the parish within which the boundaries you were. Parishes were boundaried, right? And it was enforced. Like, you couldn't go to another grade school in another parish. You didn't have to show a ticket to get into Sunday Mass or anything, but it was a kind of mentality, whereas I think now a lot of places have gone much more the direction of people are gonna find something that suits them better, right? Whether it's style of liturgy, whether it's they have RE on Wednesday night versus Sunday day, right? You know, it's like, well, there's going to be a lot of variables that are going to be involved in there. Sometimes geography, sometimes not geography, right? And so that's something that you have to deal with as well, right? And how does that work? Right? But many times people will bring up community is kind of one of the keys that makes it alive. So it's not just to say, do you go to church? At a certain point, you want to say, I go to this church. Because you're identifying with certain people, with a certain community, a certain way of doing liturgy, a certain way of whatever it might be, right? I mean, there are people that love organ music, and there are people that can't stand it. And there are some people probably that don't know the difference. But in any case, the point being, right, you know, that, well, how do we deal with that then? How do we be a church that has diverse churches? Wouldn't it be a shame here in the Helena Valley if all of our parishes were identical? Right? There's a kind of richness in some diversity. Now, I don't imagine any church is not going to have Eucharist on Sunday, and it's not going to, of course, it's going to involve bread and wine. I mean, you know, so it's not just a, what would you call it? It's not just a happy hour get together, right, if you will, right? But there's ways in which, how can that be drawn in? How can that be done, right? And then how can we reach out to others? It's really hard, and I steal this from a former pastor of yours, right? You know, you can't say you're a welcoming community. What's the answer? Somebody else has to tell you you're a welcoming community. Right? Your former pastor, right? And it was like, right. Then you got to really listen, right? You know, and not welcoming as a guest, welcoming as a member of the community or a member of the family. Families struggle with this. Sometimes families will take in studies abroad in high school, and they're going to live with a family. You bring that person in. You don't want them to be there like they're a guest, like when you have people over, right? You know, they're supposed to be a part of the family, right? How do we make people part of the family? And I think there's a lot of challenges for us in those going forward, right? Yeah.
You know, it's interesting you say that, because you can't imagine